Welcome to the next installment in our quarterly webinar series on clean energy funding opportunities. I see some familiar faces and some new names. This is obviously a ever-moving target as topics go, and happy to have veterans here as well as first-timers. So, my name is Wyatt King. I'm the director of the Greater Cincinnati 2030 District, which is the Buildings and Energy Program of Green Umbrella, our regional climate collaborative in the tri-state area. And our focus with this webinar is just to raise awareness and understanding of the landscape of opportunities for funding clean energy projects. And those of you who follow this area know that it's an ever-shifting landscape, to be sure. So our expert, as always, is Nikki Vandevoort with the City of Cincinnati's Office of Environment and Sustainability. So without any further ado, I will turn the floor over to Nikki.
All right, thank you very much. Hope everybody's doing well, and we'll just get started. All right. So this is my I think we're on like number 6
At least.
for presentations on the clean energy funding update. This started off during times when a lot of things had not yet been rolled back. And so since HR 1 passed this past 4th of July, a lot of things have changed, and we are in the thick of some of those changes. So I'll be covering what has changed and some other resources and opportunities that maybe not fully replace what had originally been available through the Inflation Reduction Act, but that there are still resources and opportunities out there. My name is Nikki Vandevoort. I work for the City of Cincinnati's Office of Environment and Sustainability, and my role there is Clean Energy and Climate Resilience Manager. I do a lot of this education and outreach, but I am also involved with developing clean energy that serves the city and our residential aggregation program. I have been involved in reaching our Soul Smart designation. So we recently received Silver designation. That's a program similar to LEED, but which shows the friendliness of a municipality towards anyone residential or commercial interested in going solar. So we do have a solar landing page and a permitting checklist, and we're working on zoning code text amendments to clarify what folks can and cannot do with solar in the city limits. So lots of work happening in the clean energy space in Cincinnati. I'm happy to be a part of it. Our agenda today will look a little bit at energy prices on the rise and what's happening now post HR 1, or other folks have referred to it as the OBBBA. We'll do an update on the tax credits and their status. I'll probably breeze through the prohibited foreign entities and materials assistance ratio requirements. Those are included in this presentation, and you will be provided these slides so that you can have a reference to look back at. But it's a lot of information, and you could spend probably a whole series of workshops just on those topics. I have a new slide devoted to State of Ohio resources and a few slides on clean energy funding strategy. I always start off with saying that this presentation is an overview of resources, but I am in no way an accountant or an attorney. And this is for general informational purposes only. All this stuff is available online, and I've curated it in this presentation. I've also included links to everything that I've sourced from so that you can read full articles and things like that. after this presentation.
And I will just note that we will be posting the slides and the recording of the webinar on the 2030 District website a few days after the presentation, and I'll circulate that the links to that once they're up.
Great, thanks. So everybody is, I'm sure, familiar with their energy and electricity prices increasing this past year. And I've included this slide recently in my presentation because it's worth kind of explaining why parts of it are increasing. So when you're considering the cost of electricity, your bill is made up of two different types, two different pots. There's the generation costs, and then there's the capacity costs. Capacity costs make up about 20% of a typical consumer's bill. Capacity pricing is interesting. It's not price for the energy itself, but pricing to ensure that there will be energy on our, our worst energy days when we need the most energy. And so those typically take place on our hottest days. And due to, I'll get into what's driving those prices, the capacity prices in the past couple of years have shot up dramatically. So I have a link here on this slide if you want to learn more about capacity prices and why that is. But to kind of cover it briefly in this slide, Ohio is part of the PJM grid. PJM stands for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, but obviously it covers a much larger geographic footprint. Capacity prices are increasing in response to demand, and demand is increasing because primarily from the research that I've seen, it's data center demand and also electric vehicles, interestingly enough, is a big driving force, but electrification in general of our buildings. There's also been an interconnection backlog for new generation in our grid. And then other things that contribute to this are power plant retirements. Certainly, as the capacity price increases dramatically, that changes the minds of folks who were maybe not able to make much of a profit on their power plants and were looking to retire them. Now the capacity prices are high. A lot of those decisions have been rolled back. And then there have been some new rules to contend with. So if you're in Duke's territory here in Southwest Ohio, their generation price increased 30% this past June. PJM expects increases of up to an additional 5% next summer across the grid. What happens, data centers in Pennsylvania or Virginia, that increases demand across the whole grid. So it's really not just what's happening locally, but across our grid that affects these prices. So I'm not going to go into my usual slide with my HR1 timeline of how did that come to be, but I will say when HR1 passed, the president signed it 4th of July of this year. It was very impactful to the Inflation Reduction Act programs. At this point, we are, as everybody's familiar with, we had a very lengthy government shutdown that ended November 12th with a funding measure that allows for several of the appropriation bills to get funded for a full year and continuing funding through January 30th, this coming January 30th, for the 9 other agencies and appropriation bills. I wanted to include a table of some of the programs that people rely on related to, these spending bills. There's an energy and water appropriations bill. There's a labor and homeland HHS spending bill, appropriations bill, and HUD has a spending bill. And so each of these committees at the Senate and the House have to come up with their ideas, swap them, come to some sort of agreement, and then eventually pass them. So where we're at right now is that a number of these programs that people rely on, especially in cold weather, like the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program or LIHEAP, or for folks who have homes that need weatherization, that rely on the Home Weatherization Assistance Program or HWAP, folks who buy Energy Star appliances, or the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, which contributes to a lot of different development projects or assistance for folks that have here in the city of Cincinnati. I know that some of that HUD funding goes towards homes that are in code violation, and then they eventually get weatherization or mold remediation or what have you. All of these types of programs are reliant on these appropriations bills actually appropriating money towards those programs. So in some of these instances, they've passed those appropriation committees at the Senate and the House, but there's no initial passage in either chamber. There's some draft language out there related to the Weatherization Assistance Program from the Senate, but again, things may not actually move again until closer to January 30th when um, uh, the deadline is again looming. I just want to point out, we had a SNAP benefits crisis that was, ended with the government shutdown and the continuing resolution, but we again are facing another uh, deadline come January 30th. That's the broader context of what's going on. And then we're going to now turn and think more about like what has happened with the IRA. So when the IRA was passed, it represented the largest investment ever in climate action and projects and programs. The tax credits specifically were a big part of the overall IRA legislation. And more than half of that was going towards, intended to go towards business tax credits, but also that includes credits for tax exempt organizations through the direct pay provision. And then you can see that uh, in my next slides, we'll refer to the actual specific credits and what are still available and what is not. There was a chunk you can see in the light blue on the left side of the circle for individual tax credits. And we'll get into that. I color code a lot of my work. So green, if you see in my slides, those are incentives tending towards individuals. Purple is tending towards businesses and tax exempt organizations or nonprofits. Blue is specifically for businesses, and black is for all of the above. So this is a consumer focused page. Uh, all of the tax credits had some sort of effect, either an acceleration or a change to them. And so all of the vehicle tax credits, whether they were for individuals, as displayed here in the gray text, or for commercial and nonprofits, which will be discussed in a later slide, all of those were early terminated as of September 30th of this year. And we have early terminations coming up of the remaining consumer-focused IRA tax credits. So there's an energy efficient home improvement credit that property must be placed in service prior to the end of this year. And then there is a residential clean energy credit. So this is for residential solar, geothermal heat pump, battery backup, etc. If it's residentially focused, it must be constructed prior to the deadline. There's a slight difference between these two. Placed in service means that it's operational and you're realizing the benefits. So if a heat pump was installed, it's functioning now in your home. Constructed for solar, they kind of split some hairs here. You may have the solar constructed, but perhaps you don't have your interconnection set up yet. So in that case, you would still be eligible if you were able to construct your solar or your geothermal heat pump by the end of this year. This is a business-focused page. So there were several incentives that were to the benefit specifically of businesses. In particular, 45L is for developers who produce energy efficient homes and apartments, whether new or doing retrofits. This credit now needs to be fulfilled by June 30th, 2026. I should mention that the majority of all of the IRA tax credits, whether they were residential or commercial focused, was intended to go through 2032 and some phasing down beyond that. So the fact that these are accelerated to, this year, next year, is a significant lost opportunity. There was also modified accelerated cost recovery system, or MACRS. I'm not as well versed in this particular incentive, but it will no longer be available for property which began construction after 2024. So yes, this was a retroactive enforcement of that early termination. This is just a quick look. If anybody here is a developer, I'd be happy to, discuss more about this particular tax credit, but it's kind of a niche one for the 45L tax credit. Most folks are interested in who are from local governments or public institutions, faith communities, or traditional nonprofits. They're interested in learning more about direct pay. And so we'll be talking about the investment tax credit after this, but just as a heads up around what is direct pay, what is that provision? Before direct pay in the Inflation Reduction Act on the left side here, a tax exempt organization that wanted to add solar would enter into a financing agreement with their designer or their architect or their solar installer. And then that private company would claim the federal tax credit, and the nonprofit would get a cut of that in their agreement. After direct pay, tax-exempt entities were able to take advantage of the full tax credit for solar and other clean energy through this. Essentially, it's a refund. Obviously, tax-exempt organizations do not pay taxes, and so you would file with the IRS to get your tax credit, but it essentially feels more like a refund. So some of the incentives in the IRA for tax-exempt folks and businesses was the 179D commercial buildings energy efficiency tax deduction. This is for energy efficiency improvements in commercial buildings, whether that be a nonprofit or a business. For improvements that were 25% or better than the energy efficiency industry standard. So this had been around, 179D had been around before IRA, but the IRA made it such that it was, I think it was more, you could make more money off of it if you were using prevailing wage and apprenticeship programs. This now has an early termination date of June 30th, 2026. So you must begin construction. And their beginning construction has a very specific definition. We'll get into that later in this presentation. You can see this is grayed out now, but there was a commercial clean vehicle credit, tax credit for EV purchases by tax exempt organizations or businesses that ended September 30th of this year. And then there is essentially an EV charging tax credit, this 30C alternative fuel vehicle refueling credit. There's that one is still eligible if it's placed in service prior to June 30th of next year. But the key here is that EV chargers must be placed in low income and rural areas, and there's a map for that. So a little bit more about 179D. This is for new commercial building owners or tax exempt organizations that can go through their designer, because this is a deduction and not a tax credit. It kind of follows that more sort of discount. The third party takes the full advantage of the tax deduction and then passes a discount to the nonprofit. But it's still possible for tax exempt organizations to take advantage of this. I'm just using that not direct pay provision. And then the EV chargers, this is open to both individuals and commercial. It's a 30% tax credit with a maximum, dollar amount on it. And I have on this slide this see the map link. We'll get into the investment tax credit. This is the big one that I think most people are thinking about. It's related to commercial clean energy investments like rooftop solar, solar fields, battery storage, wind, nuclear, hydro, geothermal, etc. What happened with HR1 is that this tax credit was bifurcated so that wind and solar have an early phase out, but these other types of clean energy are still eligible through the full 2032 and beyond timeframe, which, at least there's some funding and incentives available for those types of clean energy sources. It's just harder for an individual building to take advantage of something like hydropower, right? So I have some slides later about how you can still potentially take advantage of that tax credit and significant energy savings on your buildings. But essentially, for the wind and solar side of things, if you were to begin construction prior to the end of this year, you would get the full credit, plus you would not have to satisfy the material assistance restrictions and other prohibited foreign entity restrictions, and you must complete within 4 years. There are still, no matter what, following the passage of HR1, there are some prohibited foreign entity restrictions, no matter when you began construction, but they're a little bit easier to determine rather than the stuff that's going to come after the end of this year. If you begin construction of your, let's say you have a rooftop solar project that you want to construct, if you begin between January 1st and 4th of July of next year, you will still get the full credit. You will need to complete it within 4 years, but now you must comply with all three of the new prohibited foreign entity requirements, including that material assistance costs. And then if you begin construction after 4th of July for your rooftop solar of next year, you'll still get the full credit, but you must complete all of the new requirements. And now you have a deadline. You must place it in service by 12/31/2027. If you were to begin construction after that date, there will be no tax credits, at least as the program is designed for now. But if you're doing something like geothermal, like a commercial geothermal ground source, heat pump, that is still eligible. And I will say that particular technology, ground source heat pumps, was under Section 48 rather than Section 48E tax credits. And so they are not affected by the prohibited foreign entity restrictions. And they don't have the phase down, right? Or they don't have the early termination, so they go through 2032. Unchanged also, the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, which most of us were not considering using because it's for larger utility scale projects, had bonus credits. So I'll jump over to this next slide. It's more demonstrative. There's a 30% base tax credit for the ITC, but then there were these additional 10% or 10 or 20% tax credits that you could build on top of that. And so for projects under 1 megawatt, a 1 megawatt project is like a 4 to 5 acre project. So you probably, if you're just doing rooftop, you're definitely under 1 megawatt. It's a 30% base credit, and you would not have to meet any prevailing wage or apprenticeship program requirements. And then stackable on top of that 30% is a 10% domestic content bonus, where you would meet that if you have 100% American steel and iron and a specific percentage depending on the year of manufactured components. 10% tax credit bonus for being located within an energy community. So this is your project is on a brownfield or you are in former coal country. And there's a map for that. There's a link here in the slide. And then there's a competitive, all of the rest of these tax credits that I speak on are if you meet the requirements, you get the tax credit. There is one competitive tax credit. It's this low-income communities bonus credit. Projects must be less than 5 megawatts. Again, I explained how big 1 megawatt is. So your project, your rooftop is definitely under 5 megawatts. But it's a 10% bonus for projects located in a low-income community. There's a map for that. Or a 20% bonus for projects located on affordable multifamily housing or designated for low-income economic benefit projects. Those have been overprescribed in terms of when the competitive tax credit window opens up for application. There's been more interest than there has been availability for the funds that have been set aside for this tax credit. But the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, they've done an analysis, and at least in the past, it's harder to say with this administration, but at least in the past, direct pay projects, so if you're a public institution, a nonprofit, a university, a city, those had preferential treatment for getting the tax credit over just a traditional business applying for it. So I won't go back over all of the positives that, we're glad elective pay wasn't changed and ground source heat pumps are still eligible. There's a provision called transferability that was preserved during HR 1. There's still a loophole for leased residential solar installations. So a third party owns a residential solar like a rooftop solar on someone's home, but they own it and the homeowner can realize the benefits of, reduced energy costs and they pay, some sort of fee to have that relationship with the solar owner. Those are still allowed, so at least there's a pathway, although homeowners taking advantage of owning their own solar, that is ending at the end of this month. There is still this leased loophole that will be here through the end of 2027. Energy storage and batteries are still eligible, and even projects that are co-located with solar and wind facilities, which those have an early termination. The batteries will still be eligible through the early 2030s, and the home energy rebates programs were not affected by HR 1. In Ohio, those are forthcoming, as well as in Kentucky. Indiana, their home energy rebate program is active. So that's good, reaching energy improvement rebates for homeowners. But then, yes, of course, there were quite a few negatives with the many accelerated terminations of various tax credits. The discontinuation of consumer-facing tax credits by the end of this year, these new and complex prohibited foreign entity restrictions, the early termination of all of the clean vehicles tax credits. HR 1 also rescinded unobligated funds every major EPA Inflation Reduction Act program, and a number of those are now in litigation because EPA has attempted to claw back funding that was already obligated. And so lots of pending litigation. There was another program that I know some local developers did win, and the unobligated funding for that program for green and resilient retrofits of affordable housing was also the unobligated funding was rescinded. And I know that some of those may have been awarded, but the contracts had not been signed yet. So again, folks thinking that they had a grant and then all of a sudden they didn't. Just dip our toes into the prohibited foreign entities and material assistance rules. So on the left side, I've got some definition. A prohibited foreign entity is either a specified foreign entity or a foreign influenced entity. If you're an SFE, you are affiliated or a business in a covered nation. So there are four covered nations. It's Iran, North Korea, China, and I can't remember the other. Iran. I already said Iran. There's a fourth one. I can't remember. But when we're talking about like restrictions on solar, we're specifically talking about China because they produce so many of the solar panels and other equipment related to solar. Foreign influenced entities is if you have done work with or paid an entity where an SFE has authority to appoint a board member or has some sort of control over the company. Oh, sorry, covered nations, North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran at the very bottom there. On the right side here, material assistance from prohibited foreign entities, that targets the supply chain of taxpayers trying to claim the investment tax credit. And so this kicks in starting January 1st for projects that begin after January 1st of 2026. There are cost ratios that increase steadily throughout the coming years. And essentially, this is going to require taxpayers or folks that are going after direct pay to be very careful, or whatever company you're using to be very careful in documenting where their supplies come from in their supply chain for the project that they're doing for you. There's an ability to safe harbor currently. Um, Safe harboring is essentially getting that official beginning of construction before the end of this year so that you can avoid all of these additional requirements, or, for folks that are not quite ready to start construction this year, starting before the middle of next year so that they avoid the next level of restrictions. And so we'll talk about beginning construction and what safe harboring is. So there's two methods for establishing when a project's construction begins. There's the physical work test, and there's the 5% safe harbor test. And so the physical work test can be work that's performed on-site or off-site. Off-site would be, say, your solar project requires inverters. This is for like custom made types of things. So a custom made inverter, a custom made transformer, it's being created or built, manufactured offsite, but you've paid for it. And so that is that's triggering the physical work test before whatever deadline you're working against. Significant on-site work is essentially installation of the project. So for solar, we're talking about racking, and it does not include, there's lots of examples of what is not considered significant work. And that's things like getting your permits, grading, site leveling, surveys, mapping, securing your financing. All of that doesn't count towards this definition of beginning construction. I will say the city of Cincinnati, we are working on putting in a solar project on the Center Hill landfill, and we are beginning construction because we are installing a concrete pad. And so we've determined with council that that is meeting the definition of significant on-site work to trigger that physical work test. For the 5% safe harbor rule, this test used to apply to any solar project. There was new guidance that was put out, and so now this 5% safe harbor only applies to solar facilities that are under 1.5 megawatts. Again, that's perfectly fine for your rooftop project. And it no longer applies to wind facilities at all. But essentially, it means that you have reached the threshold of spending 5% of the total cost of your project. And so this may be like you've gone out and you've purchased your panels or your racking or your inverters for your solar project, and you've determined that that was more than 5% of your total cost of your project. Now, as you can imagine, construction projects sometimes have overruns or unexpected things are discovered, and all of a sudden that original cost you were anticipating starts to increase. So a lot of organizations have recommended aiming for 10% as a safer bet so that cost overruns won't impact your safe harbor calculation. And then also, once you begin construction, you need to be able to demonstrate continuous construction, although delays outside of your control will not, result in failure of that continuous construction. So if you have severe weather, natural disasters, permitting, backlogs, et cetera, that's out of your control. And it's really more like if in that example of the city's project, we run out there and we put in the concrete pad and then we just let the whole thing sit for 4 months and we don't move the rest of the project forward with anything. That would be a delay in construction. We would not be able to demonstrate continuous construction with something like that. Hard pivot now away from tax credits. Normally, I have a slide related to the remaining federal programs for grants. So that was a whole lot of talk about tax credits. Unfortunately, a lot of those grant programs are frozen or in litigation right now. And I've done updates since HR 1, and there's not been a lot of change on those. So I'm not including that slide anymore. But I will just say that the rebate programs are at least active for homeowners in Indiana. And they're conditionally approved for Ohio and Kentucky. So it seems that, you know, uh, I've heard through the grapevine that the administration might be modifying the program, but that it is still expected to be launched at some point. So fingers crossed that we see that sometime in 2026. But in the meantime, there are still state resources available for commercial entities, including nonprofits or for-profits, and local governments. So I just wanted to pull together something very simple here. There are links to each of these sites. The Ohio Air Quality Development Authority, OAQDA, they have two programs and a third that recently closed, I think October 30th. But for which there is expected additional funding next year. But their Clean Air Improvement Program represents kind of their approach to bond financing for businesses. This can be for eligible activities related to pollution control, energy efficiency, clean energy. Definitely worth checking that program out to see if it's worth it for your potential project. There's also the Clean Air Resource Center. This is more geared towards small businesses for folks that are employing under 100 employees. This can be for building and equipment upgrades. And it sounds like it's kind of a bespoke way of sourcing different resources to support those projects through that specific program. Out of the Ohio Department of Development, there's the Energy Loan Fund. These are low interest loans for projects between $250,000 and $1 million, geared towards small businesses, manufacturers, nonprofits, and local governments. And this is for energy efficiency upgrades and solar, if also paired with efficiency measures. So something worth looking into if you're still interested in moving forward with a project. Strategy for near-term clean energy spending. So if you are eligible for elective pay or a tax-exempt entity, you should still file for it. The IRS still has regular office hours and guidance materials. You can find frequently asked questions. Annotated tax forms can be very helpful to try and understand how to fill those tax forms out. and blueprints for the EV charging credit. I'm just realizing I should have removed the commercial clean vehicle credit 45W because that is terminated now. But those resources from the Electrification Coalition, and then Lawyers for Good Government has a ton of great resources on elective pay for tax exempt entities. So check out their website certainly. And then just being aware around the definitions and your deadlines. Is your deadline related to the beginning of construction? Do you need to be placed in service by a certain timeline? So again, electric vehicle charging needs to be placed in service by June 30th. Wind and solar, your best timeline with the fewest restrictions is to begin construction by the end of this year. But it's, if you can't do that, it's still worth trying to go after beginning construction before 4th of July next year. And then even if you can't do that, you are still going to be eligible for that tax credit if you can meet all of the PFE and material assistance restrictions if you construct after 4th of July and place in service before the end of 2027. And then for 179D, if you're doing energy efficiency upgrades that can meet that deduction, placing in service prior to June 30th of next year. Just a quick shout out. I've had folks say before that they didn't think solar was worth it in Cincinnati because it's so cloudy here. And this is just to say, yes, it is worth it. There are plenty of solar projects in our area. We have, the mild winters and the low snowfall, seasonality that still produces energy year round, so long as your building isn't too shaded. And so I have a few resources here if you were interested in soliciting quotes, but you weren't sure how to find a legitimate installer. Energy Sage's solar calculator. They have a solar calculator that you can look at yourself, but then they also provide a vetted solar marketplace, and they ensure that the providers. Their providers tend to be smaller outfits so that they're not some of these bigger companies, national companies that have faced some problems with bankruptcy and whatnot. And they make sure, their Better Business Bureau rating is high and whatnot. So they have resources for individuals, businesses, and nonprofits. And then Solar United Neighbors, they have a ton of resources, including a free solar help desk and guides for individuals, businesses, and nonprofits. Just also, because I know we're getting closer to the end of time and I want to leave time for Q&A. I had mentioned geothermal ground source heat pumps earlier, that tax credit is under Section 48, whereas the ITC and a lot of these other tax credits are under, well, the ITC is under 48E mostly. And so so long as you begin construction prior to January 1st, 2033, with a 2-year phase down, that your ground source heat pump project for a commercial or tax exempt entity would still be eligible for direct pay, the 30% tax credit, and the bonus tax credits if they're relevant. And with the added bonus that there are no PFE restrictions on this particular technology. So I stole some graphs from a Department of Energy presentation about schools. The school district for the city of Seattle has been installing only ground source heat pumps for their new school building since 2015. They had some local requirements related to if you installed a boiler, then you had to have someone with like a boiler repairman on call and available within an hour if there was ever a problem with the boiler. And so very local specific rule there, but it prompted them to look into ground source heat pumps and finding that in the long term they are while they may have high upfront costs, in the long term they're far more energy efficient than a traditional boiler. And with the 30% tax credit, they are able to get some money back and realize uh, some very significant savings off of just the traditional way of doing things. So the Wisconsin example is much more appropriate, at least in Ohio, because we don't have utility incentives, but still worth it. A savings of $500,000 is a savings of $500,000 in that scenario. Some financing strategies. So I've mentioned third-party developers. Those are typically power purchase agreements where the energy system is owned and operated and maintained by a company, and the customer's property, it's on the customer's property, and the customer purchases the system's electricity output. These are beneficial because there's no upfront capital from the customer, and you realize a lower cost of energy. And then energy savings performance contracts. This is a business model where, again, no upfront capital investment, and the company comes in and makes the energy upgrades, and then owns the infrastructure, and the customer pays a subscription fee that pays down that infrastructure and also realizes reduced utility bills. So those are strategies. Specific resources for nonprofits, particularly for solar, are on this slide. Collective Sun and Revolve, they specifically work with nonprofits and faith communities and public institutions. So check them out if you represent any of those types of organizations. And just a shout out that my office recently published our energy education resources for the winter time. So if you follow the link here in the title, that'll take you to these resources and more. We also have summer resources. And that's that. If you want to learn more about energy efficiency and electrification, please check out electrifycincy.org and our Cincinnati Solar landing page. And that's that. I'll take Q&A.
Thank you very much, Nikki, as comprehensive as always. And as I mentioned earlier, if you didn't get that the first time through, you can review both the slides and this recording in a few days once we get it posted on the 2030 website. Any questions? You can just shout out or enter it in the chat.
Hey, I've got a question, Ben Eilerman over the Rhine Community Housing. So we're looking at some projects, and we weren't in position to submit for the ODQ.
ODOD.
Yeah, the one that was
Advanced Energy Fund.
correct. That's the one. Do you know when they typically release rounds? Like I reached out to them and I said, yeah, it still has, they anticipate it still has funding, but they wouldn't give me any insight on when they typically release funds.
When
Or
I reached out to them, they told me spring of next year.
okay.
But certainly, I mean, once that goes live, I post about it on LinkedIn and I try
Sure.
and share it out. So we can, I will try and work with our social media to try and get that out through OES, all of our networks.
All right, great.
Any other questions?
Great.
All right.
Thanks for attending, everybody.